What's up, investors? It's the Russian Dude. Welcome to another episode of Thank God It's Monday podcast. Today we have Anders Puck Nielsen under the very same YouTube channel name as a guest. So once again, first of all, I want to thank Anders for accepting our invitation, appearing on this podcast. Thanks so much, Anders, for being here with us today.
Of course, and thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. So yeah, first of all, I'm assuming many people probably hear about you for the very first time. As a tradition, can you please introduce yourself, tell us about what you do here on YouTube, tell about your job, and just in general, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, as you say, I have a YouTube channel under my own name. I mostly talk about the war in Ukraine. I am a military analyst, and so that's kind of what I do. Sometimes I also touch on other topics, but it's mostly military stuff, NATO, those things. And then my day job is that I am a military analyst at the Royal Danish Defence College. I am a military officer. I wear a uniform, those things. Since the invasion started in Ukraine, most of my job has been following that war and talking about it, explaining it to the public in Denmark. I follow it closely.
Okay, so yes, as a Danish person, what made you then start following Russian-Ukrainian war? Because once again, I obviously understand whenever a person from either Russia or Ukraine is doing these kind of videos, I'm assuming the most, let's call them popular, the biggest YouTubers in this specific industry are either Russians or Ukrainians. Some of them are Americans. For example, Jake Bro, maybe you heard about this guy, because once again, America is one of the biggest ally of Ukraine. But what about Denmark? What made you, as a Danish person, start making those videos?
Many reasons, I will say, but I do have a background in Russian studies. I do understand the Russian language. I have followed the Russian military for many years. So, of course, Russia getting into like this, the biggest war that Russia has been engaged in since World War II. I mean, that's a big thing for me. And also, I think it gave me a position where maybe I have something to contribute with. So I felt that I could bring something valuable to other people by explaining some of these things. So that's a part of it. But I think a very important part is also just the fact that these are historic events. This is changing European security. There's going to be one time before the full-scale invasion and another time after, and we don't know exactly how this is going to end or what it's going to lead to, but it will definitely change also security for Denmark and for all the other European countries. So I think it's important that we keep an eye on this and focus on it. And sometimes I think actually people forget or, that how important this really is and what the potential actually is of these things that are happening right now. I think it's fair to compare this to other big historic changes, like the Second World War changed European security. The fall of the wall in Berlin in 1989, right? That also changed European security. I think what's happening now is bigger than the fall of communism in terms of how it's going to change European security. So I just think it's really important to follow.
I think mentioned the full-scale invasion and everything. Do you think Russia will continue if it's not stopped in Ukraine, if it is not, if Putin is not changed as a leader of Russia, if pretty much everything stays the same, Ukraine either collapses or taken over by Russia, overridden by Russia? Basically, if nothing changes and Putin is not held accountable, you think he will continue marching across Europe?
I think marching across Europe maybe gives the wrong picture, but I definitely don't think his ambitions will end in Ukraine. His ambition is to establish Russia as the big military power in Europe. And I think ultimately what he would like to bring about was some kind of collapse of the NATO alliance, which would mean that Russia would be in a position to deal with all the other countries on a sort of bilateral basis, right? Instead of dealing with this bloc of Western European countries, he would be dealing with Finland and Poland and Lithuania and Sweden individually. And in those relations, Russia would always be the great power and would be able to, get their way. I think really that's, and then, a lot, the Putin regime is very much sort of ad hoc driven, right? It's, I don't think they always know what they're going to be doing in a couple of years, because it depends on how things pan out. And if they come out of things in Ukraine with a feeling of success and a feeling that there is momentum, then I think absolutely they would try to capitalize on that and push forward and take the next country. Ultimately, I think Putin feels that he has the right to a sphere of influence, and that includes more or less all the old sort of communist countries that could potentially become under Russian rule in one way or another. So, I am concerned about those things, and I think his ambitions are definitely much more than just stealing some land in eastern Ukraine. I think that's perhaps the biggest mistake we can make in the West, to think that this is a war about where the border should be in eastern Ukraine, and once they just agree on where the border is, then things are going to be fine, and Ukraine and Russia can go on, because this war is not about stealing a bit of territory in Donetsk or Zaporizhia regions.
I think you make an extremely good point whenever you said that Putin would want to see a NATO alliance collapse maybe more than ever. Maybe this could be his primary goal. Because I think I don't know, at this point it might not be a myth, even though Putin says it all the time. NATO tricked me, NATO betrayed me, NATO lied to me. But it might be, well, a possibility, because in reality, in early 2000s, or even before Putin was the president of Russia, he even kind of liked West. He was handshaking with American leaders, no problems, that smiles all around, America, Russia, two great friends. Then something, quote unquote, changed. And so once again, NATO, speaking about NATO, that he feels maybe betrayed by the alliance, that I don't think NATO would ever maybe take Russia as a part of its member. But maybe that's what Putin in some crazy way hoped that would happen. So do you think maybe that this is where Putin's insecurities are coming from? That NATO, Russia, betrayal, then some broken promises, things like this, and Ukraine just became kind of an excuse for Putin to let out his anger, to say that we want NATO bases far away from Russia. So long story short, this whole entire war is just about Putin trying to eliminate his insecurities about Russia and Ukraine cooperation.
To some extent, I mean, it's this whole narrative about how NATO tricked Russia and they lied to me and they tricked me and all those things. It's a kind of strange narrative, right? Because if you're the leader of Russia and you've been the leader of Russia for 25 years and they keep making tricks on you, right, and cheating you, like, what does it say about you as a leader of Russia? I think so. It's a funny narrative, but it's one that he feels to be passionate about. I would say the way I see it is that Putin sees NATO as pretty much an extension of the United States. So it's about American imperialism ultimately, and his concern about NATO is about Russia's position as a great power, that all this NATO expansion makes it impossible for Russia to exercise its position or as a great power in what he likes to call the near abroad, right? So it's these countries that he feels that this is the sphere of influence. So that is Ukraine, the Belarus, but it's also other countries that I think ultimately Putin thinks that Russia has this privileged position over the Baltic states, over Finland, for matter, and probably also some of the other countries that used to be part of the Eastern Bloc, such as Poland, for example. So I would say it's more about Russia's position as a great power and how he feels he's fighting for that, and not really concerned that NATO is going to invade Russia. I mean, they sometimes talk about that, but I think that it's pretty clear the Russian military has always been strong, and it's not really an option for NATO to invade Russia itself. So I see it more as these other things.
Yeah, definitely would say that, yeah, we hear all the time, like, yeah, if we are not victorious in Ukraine, NATO is going to invade, NATO is going to build bases in Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. That's why we have to keep fighting. So, yeah, you did mention that you are trying to read Russian sources since you do know Russian language. So I hear the familiar arguments here pretty much, yeah, which I completely understand as well. Also, whenever I was preparing for this interview, researching you and everything, like, I guess, proper KGB officer would do, even though I'm not. But I did see that you did an interview with United 24, which is Zelensky's pretty much initiative, which is a very high organization. They even contacted me, wanted to cooperate as well, but then they realized I actually have Russian passport, so blah blah. But yeah, it's not about me. I did see there's some very couple interesting topics, and once again, I'm assuming a lot of our viewers have not seen that podcast. Even though if you want after this interview, you can go ahead and watch it. But I want you to answer a couple of interesting questions here because I found them extraordinarily interesting, at least for me. The first question is, do you think Ukraine and Europe can defend itself without the help of the United States?
I think the biggest problem in Europe is actually the political will. Like Europe is extraordinarily rich. So if we really, invested in this, then of course the European countries could support Ukraine to win the war. And if the European countries even themselves engaged, I mean, that would be even um, even more powerful, right? But it's about the political will. And we have to understand that the European states have basically spent 80 years just accepting American leadership since World War II, that America was sort of the biggest force in Europe. They were the leader of the Western alliance. And European countries are not used to taking on that role. And that's really the big problem right now. There is a vacuum of leadership. Donald Trump is not willing to be that leader. I don't think Biden was a very strong leader either, but at least he did take on the role. So, but we don't really see it from the European countries. The big European countries are really struggling. So I think that's the biggest problem, really. If the European countries decided to really invest in this and make it a top priority, say just on the level that the pandemic was a couple of years ago, right? The kinds of investments that we could suddenly make to beat this virus that was all over. Like if we make those kinds of investments, then absolutely Europe without the United States could support Ukraine to victory.
You did mention the vacuum of leadership, especially like Biden not being a strong leader, and this is pretty much when the invasion happened. Do you think then the next follow-up question? Do you think this is pretty much Putin? What also Putin felt that Biden might not be as responsive, not maybe as decisive, not maybe as confident in making his decisions against Russia, and that's why Putin thought, okay, now is the perfect time to invade Ukraine, while America maybe it's not at its biggest strength, it's not at its strongest moment of its history.
I think, yeah, it's in some way, right? I think Putin sees America in decline. He does not believe that America is going to be this superpower that is on top of the world, sort of alone. He sees the transition to this multipolar system where Russia and the United States and China, there are many sort of power centers around the world. So I think he sees a decline of American power. I don't know that it was his assessment that Biden would be weak and therefore he could start this invasion, because I think actually he expected to win very quickly. I think he expected the war to be over before Biden would even have a chance to do anything. Yeah, so it would be this just very quick war.
That's this 3-day.
Yeah, the 3-day war. I think maybe he thought it's going to be a couple of weeks, but I definitely think within a month this is over. And that's not how it turned out. I think afterwards he was probably pleasantly surprised that Biden did not go more in on this. I think there were opportunities, especially in the early months, sort of in maybe through 2022, that if there had been stronger support there, that it could really have put Russia under pressure, and Russia could have lost the war there. I think they managed actually to play the American administration quite a bit, right? We'll very often hear people from the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, these people talking about how Russia was ready to use nuclear weapons in the autumn of 2022, and I think this shows how the Russians basically. I mean, there's no way they were going to use nuclear weapons. I don't buy that explanation at all. But I think it shows that they were successful in information operations and to influence the Biden administration, and I think they were probably a little surprised how well that worked. So that's kind of how we ended up now in year 4 of the war, and we're basically seeing it's playing out again now with the Trump administration, right? And how they try to sort of influence him to continue doing nothing.
We will talk about Trump for sure a little bit later, because before we go into deep, I guess, into this particular topic, another question from that podcast, which I found incredibly interesting. What peace really means for Ukraine?
Yeah, what does peace mean for Ukraine? I think peace ultimately means that Russia accepts that that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country that they cannot invade, right? So its peace is ultimately for Ukraine, that this is the Ukrainian war of independence, and Russia accepts defeat. That would be peace, right? So Russia does not invade again. I think it's the question about territory is more difficult. I don't necessarily. It might be really difficult for Ukraine to get back all their territory. So, but they might get to a point where they can gain their independence without having to fight back every square kilometer. And ultimately, that's up to the Ukrainians then to decide when to end the war, I guess, in that case. But we're very far from that point. I would say we're nowhere near the point where Putin is going to accept defeat and to acknowledge Ukraine's sovereignty, or that he does not have a sphere of influence that includes Ukraine. He's still fighting for all of Ukraine, and that's the important thing to know, that this war is not a war about territory in eastern Ukraine. It's a war about the political control of all of Ukraine, and the offensive that the Russians have going right now in eastern Ukraine. It's about putting pressure on Ukraine. It's about putting pressure on the Zelensky government. It's about putting pressure on the Western governments, so that ultimately we lose the will to continue fighting. Ukraine loses the will to continue fighting. We lose the will to continue supporting Ukraine. That's what this offensive is about. It's not really about taking this or that village in eastern Ukraine. And so we are very, very far from anything I would call Ukrainian victory. And we're even further away from anything I would call Russian victory, but that's another story.
What do you think it will take for Russia not to invade again, or for Ukraine at this point? What will need to happen so Putin stops with these crazy ideas, assuming Putin is still at the head of Russia?
I think ultimately the way that empires stop thinking that they can be empires is when they start losing wars. So that's how other empires in Europe have stopped being empires. That's how the Brits learned it, the French, the Germans. They all began losing wars, the Italians, right? And once you start losing wars badly enough, you start, it changes something in the mentality, sort of the national self-understanding. And I think ultimately that's what will have to happen, that Russia loses this war so badly that it just becomes obvious that we cannot control Ukraine if they don't want, right? If they don't want us there. And for me, I will just say, I think ultimately the idea that a country with about 140 million people, that would be Russia, can control a country with about 40 million. I mean, Ukraine is too big for that. So I don't really see a way where it's feasible for Russia to get that control over Ukraine that they want in the long run. But it might take a long time before that translates into political understanding in Moscow that we have to stop doing this. So
no, that you mentioned that Ukraine is too big for Russia to take. I think that's pretty much perfectly sums it up. All the gains that Russia pretty much made since the beginning of this war, majority of them, huge percentage, is what they were able to get within first weeks, months maximum. Since then, Ukrainians obviously took Kharkiv region, Kherson region, big parts of them, and then that's it. It was just grinding, meter souls, hundreds of thousands injured, dead from the Russian side, just getting, I don't know what, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka, 2 or 3 cities which are of a significant importance, and that's pretty much it. I mean, there is absolutely no way I see that Putin, Ministry of Defense of Russia, Russian military, Russian army ever goes further than a couple of regions they are going through right now, which are, once again, primarily Luhansk and Donetsk region. So yeah, whenever you said that Ukraine is too big for Russia to take, that's pretty much perfectly sums it up.
yeah,
So I
unfortunately,
promise.
though, I mean,
Yes.
the problem with it is that Putin still believes that if he can just uphold the pressure long enough, then the Ukrainians are going to get so tired of the war and want peace so much that they are going to surrender, right? That if he can just throw big enough airstrikes on Kyiv, then eventually the citizens of Kyiv will demand from Zelensky that this war ends now and just give them whatever they want, right? So he still has this idea that he can terrorize the population of Ukraine into surrender. And that's, that's not going to work. Generally, like these kinds of terror bombardments, they almost never work. And I don't see them working in this case either, but there might be, it might take a very long time before the leadership in the Kremlin begin understanding that this is not working and it's not going to give the results they want. And as long as we in the West keep focusing on, well, we should equip Ukraine to defend themselves. For example, we've seen over the last week, Donald Trump has been talking about how he's really angry with Putin and those things. And he wants to give Ukraine defensive weapons. Well, that's fine, but that's not going to put pressure on Putin. If you just give Ukraine more air defense missiles to protect their cities a bit more, well, Putin is just going to build more factories producing drones so they can make bigger airstrikes. So those missiles are not enough. Right? You cannot, from a Ukrainian point of view, you cannot make this war stop by just defending yourself. You have to put Russia itself under bigger pressure. And unfortunately, with the level of support I see Ukraine getting, I think it's going to take longer than it would have for Putin to start understanding this.
I mean, yeah, you just made perfect sense. How can you win a war or at least force your enemy to surrender if you're just defending? Because, yeah, it's just like your enemy is attacking. There's no reason for Putin to change anything pretty much. And yeah, I know this approach, just constantly bombarding cities, hoping the civilians will surrender at this point. That is the stubborn, inhumane approach that Putin is pretty much doing, not just even in Ukraine, but everywhere. Like since he was a president in Russia with the elections, it was always, even when Navalny was alive in 2010s, in the early 2000s, if something questionable was happening from the presidential administration, Putin was winning another elections. There was some unrest, some protests on the street. People were going, tens, hundreds of thousands of people were going on the streets across entire Russia. What he did was just nothing, silence, ignore like it never happened, never showed on TV. And eventually people just like, okay, whatever, they're not paying attention to us. So what's the point in trying? Unfortunately, yeah, that is a little bit too familiar approach of Putin, what he is doing his whole life, political career, and now it is exactly what we see, guys, in Ukraine he is doing. But, well, here, Ukrainians are resilient people. Whenever your friends, relatives are dying, whenever your constant city is under bombardment, shaking, you're in the air raid sirens, I mean, it's hard to just accept and just whatever. Sometimes, most of the times, maybe I would say, makes people angry even more, makes people be even united even more against Putin because, like, it needs to be over in one way or another. Yeah, hopefully it's not going to be Putin's way.
Yeah, but if I can say, if I can broaden out the discussion a little bit, we talked about how Putin's bigger goal is to see if he can basically make NATO collapse. And, to some extent, I think this is working for him. NATO is weaker than it has been, ever. On the one hand, NATO is stronger because it has more countries, and Finland and Sweden joined. But at the same time, the crisis in NATO is enormous, right? And this whole concern about is America committed to NATO? Is what's going to happen here with if there is a war, or people going to stand together? Is there the political will to actually fight for each other? And does Putin believe that he can actually make the Americans not fight for the others if they have to? So I think in that sense, you can say maybe if it's not working in Ukraine, the pressure he's putting on Ukraine is actually creating fissures within NATO that can still benefit Russia, even if it doesn't immediately lead to victory in Ukraine.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, that is what unfortunately we're all seeing, that some miscommunication, some fractures are happening. So it always feels like maybe when you're desperate the most, maybe when this is when miracles and some other good things happen, unexpected surprises come wherever from. We don't know. That's why there are miracles. That's why there are surprises. Because good always should beat evil in the end. So we need to hope for this outcome. As I promised, we will return to Trump. And I guess maybe since we spoke about NATO briefly, I guess this is the good time. What do you even think about Putin's Trump relationship? Specifically, I'm interested in before Trump was president, whenever he was like, I'm going to solve the problem, 24 hours, war is over. Then the very first couple of months of the presidency when it felt like Trump and Putin were the best friends ever. And now, and where is it going?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think it's always difficult to, analyze these things from afar, right? But I think ultimately it's a very asymmetric, right? I think it seems that Trump really looks up to Putin, that he admires Putin in significant ways, and that he really hopes that there can be a future where the United States and Russia can cooperate and things like that. I don't think Putin shares that vision at all, but I think Putin has, you can say many things about Putin, but he is good with people, in the sense that he's very good at figuring out how to manipulate other people into doing what he wants. And that's basically my reading of this, that Putin has been very, very good at identifying that Donald Trump has this idea of a special relationship that he can then try to take advantage of. I also think ultimately it's not really in Putin's interest to, take this anywhere. Ironically, Putin needs the United States to be an enemy. Putin needs the West that he can, to legitimize his own regime, this constant threat from the outside to be there. So it's actually not really in Putin's interest that they are two good friends. So he has been trying to play this game where he basically just has delayed and delayed and delayed things, and made sure that Donald Trump doesn't do anything, doesn't deliver any weapons to Ukraine and those things. But I don't think it's going anywhere, because I don't think Putin wants that. He actually wants Donald Trump to play the role of the American president that we're kind of used to. He just wants Donald Trump to be a not very good American president, but still an American president that can function as the enemy. And ironically, that probably also means that to some extent, Putin actually wants Donald Trump to continue delivering weapons to Ukraine, just not too many, but to continue to deliver something, so that he can play this role.
So he can probably even justify the war, saying to the people of Russia, look, Americans are still sending weapons to Ukraine, like Europe sending weapons to Ukraine. So that's why we have to keep fighting, because it's the whole wide world against us. We're defending ourselves. So I guess, yeah, in this way, you're right, if I would say. And traditionally, by the end of the podcast, there is only one single question that everyone has to answer. Don't overthink it. Just say whatever first thing that comes to your mind. You don't even need to make it long or evaluate your answer. Just whatever, say first thing that comes to your mind. One sentence is more than enough. The question goes as following. If you're in front of Putin, what will you tell him?
What will I tell him? I don't know. That's I would say, can you not see really that what you're doing is destroying the potential of Russia being a great power in the future? Can you really not see how counterproductive it is that you are pushing Ukraine against you like that? You will go into history as the Russian president who lost Ukraine. That's actually quite a feat when you think about it, because not that long ago, I think most people, both in Russia and in Ukraine, would have felt that, okay, we're kind of close. And that's not the case anymore. And it will never be that again. And, Putin is a smart guy in some ways, but at the same time, he is incredibly dumb that he can't see that, which I think is obviously is obvious to most other people. So I think that's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's, I would say, one of my favorite answers, because since the beginning of the war, one of the main responsibilities, I would even say, not the goals, but responsibilities of my work here on YouTube was trying to protect whatever left reputation Russia as a country has left, because, yeah, Putin with his propaganda is doing so much to destroy the reputation and future of Russia, because once he's gone, he would not care. But yeah, like you said, he is just not just destroying Ukraine, not just destroying alliances, friendships, brotherhoods, relatives, turning away from each other, but he is also destroying Russia's future. And this is a good country. It just does not have a good leadership. Well, thank you so much, Anders, for joining the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Another episode of Thank God It's Monday podcast. Yeah, I guess. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.